All right, I'm unmuted.
All right. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Again, thanks a lot for the invitation. The inspiration for this talk goes back about 35 years ago. I had just moved to San Antonio, Texas, and I wanted to meet some of the local birders. So I volunteered for the Christmas count. And the compiler told me that he put me in the best area with the best group. So I was pretty excited because I hadn't done much birding in Central Texas before. So I met them at some convenience store, and the 4 people were already in one car. So I sort of followed them in my car. And we trundled down this dirt road. And as we walked along, as we were driving along, I don't know why my slides aren't advancing here. There we go. We flushed from the side of the road large flocks of white-crowned sparrows. And in Central Texas in the winter, there can be 10, 11 other species mixed in with these big white-crowned flocks. And so I was very surprised that the car ahead of me was just barreling down the road without even stopping to try to figure out what these birds were. And this is a Christmas count. And we were in the area, but I figured, okay, maybe they have some system. And so we got to the first stop, and they were already out of their car. And so I got out of my car, and I said, so what did you guys do about those big flocks of sparrows back there? And they were all 4 of them were standing there, and they all swiveled their head at me, and they said in unison, oh, this is giving me, they said in unison, we don't do sparrows. And I was kind of like, well, I was thinking to myself, okay, this is a Christmas bird count. I don't think you're allowed to like write off a whole group of birds and not count them, but that is exactly what they did. And I was the new guy. I just shut up and went along with the crowd, and we didn't report hundreds of sparrows that we saw during the day. So it really drove home to me that sparrow identification is something that people find very intimidating. And you also see that, so a lot of people think of sparrows looking like this. We call them little brown jobs, and they have a lot of confusing pattern, and they're not much color, and they can, you sort of get into the we don't do sparrows. And of course, now, and 40 years ago, we only counted birds on Christmas counts. But if you do eBird, you're now counting birds every day and doing essentially a Christmas count every time you go out birding. And if you're not comfortable with sparrows, then a lot of your, this is giving me trouble, a lot of your eBird checklists might look like this. This is actually, I am an eBird reviewer, this actually is a legal eBird checklist. And if you can't identify the sparrows you see, this is in fact how you should report them. But obviously it'd be a lot more informative if we could identify these sparrows further than that. And that's what I'm going to try to help you do today is get to the point where if you do find sparrows intimidating and you skip over a lot of them and just leave them as unidentified, hopefully I can help you make some progress with that. All right, I'm going to get the hang of this. For some reason, it's doing things backwards. So as a professor, I taught classes for a long time, and I'm sort of reluctant to admit that it probably took me longer than it should have to have an epiphany one day that I'd been going about teaching the wrong way. And the wrong way to teach is to think of a subject and then think to yourself, how should I best teach this subject? But that's a teacher-centered approach to teaching. And I had this epiphany that many of other people have had that I really ought to be thinking first about how students learn, and then try in my teaching to facilitate that learning process. So the fun thing for me putting this talk together was I really thought about not only how do we identify birds, but how do we learn to identify birds? So how do we identify birds, and how do we learn to identify birds? And I think if I polled all of you and I said, right over there in the chat box, how we really identify birds, I think most of you would come up with this. We identify birds by field marks. Okay, so things like this field sparrow, we know there's 3 or 4 critical field marks that you use to identify them. The classic example that's always used is the yellow-rumped warbler. They have the bright yellow rump, and they're pretty variable birds otherwise, but you see that yellow rump and you know you have a yellow-rumped warbler. Now, for many of you who don't go back, I learned to bird in the mid 60s. And in that era, we knew that field marks really came from something known as the Peterson System. And this was developed by Roger Tory Peterson when he published his first field guide in 1934. And that field guide, the early Peterson guides, really revolutionized the whole study of natural history by providing a systematic way to identify organisms that wasn't based on the museum-based sort of dichotomous keys that had been used for a couple hundred years prior to that. And in the early Peterson guides, there were these plates of that would have 12, 15 species of birds on them. And there'd be these little, very schematic drawings of birds. But so he illustrated here, this is part of one of the plates from an early Peterson on the white crown and the white-throated sparrow. And the Peterson system used these little black lines to indicate these critical field marks. And so you right away, by seeing these pictures, you knew that both these birds have black and white striped crowns, but this arrow shows you the difference here, which is a white throat and a gray throat. And they were really wonderful figures in the sense that you could scan them and very quickly learn to appreciate the differences between similar species, which were all grouped together on a single plate. But this system then of field marks is certainly the way I learned to identify birds and the way a lot of people have learned to identify birds. And as I said, it really revolutionized the study of natural history, because before Peterson, the only way you could identify a bird was to shoot it and take it inside and make a museum skin out of it and then work through these horrible dichotomous keys to identify it. And Peterson really made it possible for the first time to identify birds in the field. The interesting thing that I had wondered for a long period of time is, well, these black lines sure are useful, but you look in other field guides and you don't see them. And I learned that the Peterson system actually is not just copyrighted, it's actually patented. And what's patented is the use of these little black lines. And so if any other field guide wants to copy those, they have to license it from the publisher, which nobody does. So that's why we don't see those little black lines in other field guides. But the Peterson system, again, was this gigantic leap, really made a lot of field biology and natural history possible. But the question is that the end of it? Is there something beyond field marks? And do experienced birders really use field marks? Because if you go out in the field with an elite or a very experienced birder, they instantaneously identify the vast majority of birds that they see. They just pop up. That's a song sparrow, that's a field sparrow, that's a swamp sparrow. And you're thinking to yourself, well, are they just running through like a checklist of field marks extremely quickly? And I think the answer to that is no. And I think you can illustrate this by this hypothetical encounter that I'm going to describe between an experienced and an inexperienced birder. And I've been on both sides of this conversation many times, and I bet you'll recognize it when I describe it. But so these two birders meet, and the inexperienced birder says, what you been seeing? And the experienced birder goes, well, bunch of song sparrows. And the inexperienced birder goes, oh, really? How do you know these are song sparrows? And the experienced birder kind of hesitates and goes, they look like song sparrows. So the inexperienced birder is thinking to himself, him or herself, boy, these experienced birders are jerks. They won't share their knowledge. And the experienced birder is thinking, well, that was a terrible answer, but that's the truth. I mean, I don't know. They look like song sparrows. And I think that's because once you have a fair amount of experience, you do go beyond field marks and you start using another system for identifying birds. And that system has been called the Cape May School of Identification, mostly by people who live in New Jersey. I actually think it started in Sweden. But this school is based on a completely different concept called jizz. And you may have heard this term. Somebody might say, oh, that is the jizz of a herring gull or the jizz of a broad-winged hawk. But maybe you haven't seen it spelled before and you didn't know it's spelled like this. And I put it in all caps because it's actually an acronym. And it's an acronym for General Impression of Size and Shape. And so this is really almost diametrically opposite to the idea of field marks. Field marks are the idea that you sort of ignore a lot of the characteristics of the bird and you focus on these 2 or 3 really distinctive, unique features. But this is the opposite. This is taking the totality of the bird and using that to identify the species. And when people first sort of hear about this approach, what they usually say to themselves is, oh, that's basically an educated guess, right? And the answer is no, it's not. It's actually much more accurate than field marks and much more rapid. And that's because, again, that it doesn't just rely on 1 or 2 marks, it takes in the totality of everything you're seeing about the bird. So if we go back to our yellow-rumped warbler, you've got in your head that yellow-rumped warblers have yellow rumps, and that's their field mark. But, Cape May warblers and magnolia warblers both have yellow rumps. And so if you're just relying on that 1 mark, you're going to be fooled sometimes. And so the best way to identify birds is by this jizz. And there's been a lot of talk and writing about this over the last few years as people have come to realize that this is the way that people identify birds. So we get back to this question then, if you're trying to take your identification skills to another level, you really want to get to this level where you're identifying birds by their jizz. And so how do we learn to identify something like this Savannah sparrow by its jizz? Well, there are several alternatives here, one of which is you could read books describing the jizz of birds. And there actually have been a lot produced in the last few years. And one of those is by my very good friend, Rick Wright. He wrote a book, ironically, for the Peterson Guide series on sparrows. And this book is very much focused on trying to teach you the jizz of birds. But the drawback to this approach is illustrated by the fact that the account of the song sparrow in Rick's book is 14 pages long. So I just saw a bird I think might be a song sparrow. So I whip out this book and I read 14 pages to find out if that's actually what I saw. So I'm afraid my argument is that this is a really hard thing to describe. Again, it's the totality of the bird. It's its shape, it's its posture, it's its behavior, it's where it is, it's what it's doing, the time of year, everything is sort of incorporated into this. So my argument is basically that jizz can be learned but not taught. Well, that's kind of strange. But I think jizz is something that you acquire subconsciously. And basically, this comes from the idea that I think we use the region of our brain that allows us to recognize human faces. If you think about it, this is really important identification problem for humans to interact successfully socially, is to be able to identify each other. And when you meet a friend of yours, you don't say, oh, that must be Mary because she has blonde hair and thin lips and a broad nose. That would be using field marks. Instead, you just instantly recognize the whole totality of Mary's face. And again, it's extremely accurate. When you see people from the front that you never make a mistake. And that really is illustrated when you meet a set of identical twins. When you first meet them, you're like, oh, I can't believe how anybody could ever tell them apart. But after you interact with them, maybe over a couple of weeks, and you become familiar with them, you start to think, boy, I don't really know why I thought they were so hard to tell apart. And again, it's not because you're noticing, difference in the structure of the nose or the eyebrows. It's just you've become familiar with both of their faces and you've learned to instantly identify them with a very high degree of accuracy. So our brains are already trained to do this. And I think the idea is that we just have to recruit that part of our brain to help us identify birds. And that's why experienced birders over time, becoming familiar with birds, eventually assimilate sort of this jizz and start to identify birds that way. And so I think the recognizing faces or birds by jizz comes from familiarity. We just have to become familiar. And the great news about this is that it doesn't take any work. You know, it's not like you have to have a whole big check sheet of field marks that you're reading every time you see a bird. You really just have to let your brain work on it for a little bit. And so I think the key here for how to learn JIS is to linger over identified birds. And so if there's one lesson that I took away from sort of this analysis, is that a lot of times we're making a mistake if we're trying to learn how to identify birds, because we look at a bird and we say, oh, what is that? Oh, that's a song sparrow. And then we immediately look away and we look at another bird. If we're trying to get better with identifying sparrows, we should spend a little time just watching that song sparrow. And again, letting our brain sort of by osmosis become familiar with it. And I use song sparrows a lot as an example because they have a very unique JIS. They're loose, floppy birds that don't really look like a lot of other similar species. And because they're so common, it's really good one to learn the JIS of. But the problem here is, though, is that just lingering over some random unidentified bird isn't going to help you. You've got to know what that bird is so that you're associating that familiarity with a particular species. And this goes back to humans. Again, I taught classes all the time. I want to learn my students' names. What I do, I give them name tags. And so the first couple of weeks, they have to wear their name tags. And then I become familiar with them. We don't need the name tags anymore. So my argument is for learning bird identification, field marks are the name tags. That's what you use initially to put a name on the bird. And then if you allow your brain to familiarize itself with a bird, you start to assimilate the JIS. Again, it comes back to lingering over identified birds. Okay. So I think that's the key. So what I'm going to do, though, mostly in this talk then, is to try to help you put these name tags on the birds, is to try to go through how to identify the commonly occurring sparrows in this area so that you can become confident enough to start assimilating this JIS. All right, so let's start with the question, what is a sparrow? This is not as easy to answer as you might think. So we've got this white-throated sparrow as an example. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about sparrows are the quote unquote New World sparrows. And these are currently members of the family Passerellidae. And this is a relatively new family. If you look in most of the current field guides, you're going to find sparrows classified in the family Emberizidae. And for years, we talked about the Emberizid sparrows to refer to this group. But in 2017, the New World sparrows were split off from the Old World buntings. Before 2017, there was one large family, the Emberizidae, which included both the Old World buntings and the New World sparrows. Those were split. The Old World buntings are now the Emberizidae, and we have this new family, the Passerellidae, for the New World sparrows, like this white-throated sparrow. So are you confused now? I love taxonomy. So just know that I'll be referring to these as the passerellid sparrows, and that's where that sort of thing comes from. So what is a passerellid sparrow then? What defines, this is a fox sparrow over here. And the thing is, I'd like to be able to tell you there's some visible feature that makes a sparrow a passerellid sparrow. But we live in the era where what makes them a passerellid sparrow is their DNA. It's their genetic similarity. And there actually aren't any morphological features which are really unique to passerellid sparrows. They're unique in their DNA, and that tells us they're evolutionarily related and belong in the same family. But there certainly are a suite of characters that we tend to associate with passerellid sparrows. We think of them as seed-eating birds. In the winter, we see them at our feeders a lot on the ground eating seed. But I've called them partially granivorous because we need to remember that in the breeding season, they do eat insects and they do feed their insects to their young because of the high protein requirements. But they do tend to have these small triangular bills that are specialized for eating seeds. The fox sparrow I've shown here actually has one of the larger bills of a passerellid sparrow. They tend to be very ground-oriented birds. We find them on or near the ground. A few exceptions like chipping sparrows in the breeding seasons will get up in the canopy, but generally speaking, we see them at about eye level or below. The thing that makes them, of course, difficult is that they are very cryptic. They tend to have browns and tans and grays and rusty colors, not a lot of bright red or blue or yellow. So they're generally very cryptic birds. They generally are, again, open habitats, fields, field edges. The one conspicuous exception to this in our area is white-throated sparrows. They will be found usually near the ground in the middle of the forest, but most of the other species you're going to find in open habitats. And the thing that really defined the old family Emberizidae was the very special open cup nests that sparrows build on the ground. But now the passerellids share this character with the Emberizids, so it's not unique to the passerellids. All right, so let's talk about some identification issues. The first thing is there's a lot of birds that look like passerellid sparrows that are not. And honestly, I could probably make the whole talk about these birds, but I'm just going to touch on a couple quick ones. This is by far the bird that is most commonly confused with sparrows. If you're on any of the Facebook groups about, what is this bird? And, you just, every other post seems to be, I saw this new sparrow, what is it? And when I teach bird identification, the thing that I always emphasize is the first thing is the bill, and the bill. And this is not a small triangular seed-eating bill. These birds do eat seeds, but that's a long pointed blackbird bill. And of course, this is a female red-winged blackbird. They're smaller than males, so when they appear at the feeders, people often get very confused about them. And they're extremely common. So it's certainly a bird you want to learn pretty well and not confuse with a sparrow. The other bird that I think provides a lot of confusion is this one. And this one is confusing because it has sparrow in its name. This, of course, is a female house sparrow. But the old world sparrows are in a different family, the Passeridae. And in the old days, we used to call them weaver finches. And I still kind of like that name because it does emphasize that they're not really sparrows in the sense of the New World sparrows. And again, right away, the bill, that's a very large bill for compared to what most passerellid sparrows have. The males, I think, are very distinctive, but the females are often confused with passerellid sparrows. The bill is one thing. The very plain breast is another. There's very few markings on the breast, even on the face. And then this big blonde eyebrow. Those things are fairly unique to female house sparrows. So they hopefully, that'll help you not confuse these with things like chipping sparrows or white crowns or anything else. All right, so let's talk about some sparrows finally. So what I'm going to use is this simplified approach, and there are several elements to that, and I just want to quickly go over that. One of that is to not to necessarily get every bird down to species initially, but let's break them into groups. And I have 4 groups that I've broken them into. And your first goal, if you're really intimidated and unsure about sparrows, is to at least get the bird you're looking at into one of these groups. And they're pretty distinctive, and I think that will be easy for you. And then once you've done that, you've only got 2 or 3 other birds in that group to really consider as other possibilities. The second component of this is do not consider rarities, okay? You open up your big Sibley field guide, there's 54 sparrows in there from all over North America, and you're looking at a sparrow you can't identify, and you decide it's probably a Cassin sparrow from Arizona or a Bachman sparrow from the Carolinas, and you're just going to be led down a path that really is going to confuse you. So just the chances that you're going to, if you're chasing a rarity, okay, but that you're going to encounter one of these super rare birds just out general birding is about 1 in a million. I've been birding for almost 60 years now, and it still is a red letter day many years apart where I encounter some sort of mega rarity. So don't start bringing up Cassin sparrows or Bottery sparrows or something like that. I'm going to give you three species that I consider to be confusion birds. They're ones that really stump a lot of people because they're quite variable. And you should keep this little checklist of these three birds in your head. And every time you see a sparrow you can't identify, ask yourself why it isn't one of these three species. And we'll talk about these in a minute. As I've already emphasized, once you identify the bird, linger over it. So it'll be easier to identify the next time. And the other thing that's really key to the simplified approach is do not look at sparrows in July or August. If you really want to be confused, look at sparrows in July and August. But if you're trying to, because the problem with July and August is juvenile sparrows. And the term juvenile is not the same as the term immature. Juvenile is the first plumage that a bird has when it leaves the nest. Okay. And so here's an example. All juvenile sparrows have finely streaked breasts. So here's a juvenile sparrow. You know, at some time I really wish I could say I give $20 for anybody who can tell me what this is. And you know, these are birds that really have to be identified by jizz, because you're probably surprised to learn this is a juvenile chipping sparrow. This is what they look like for the first 5 or 6 weeks that they're out of the nest. And field sparrows, swamp sparrows, song sparrows, everything sort of looks these really finely streaked juvenile birds. So wait until early September when most of them have molted out of this into either adult-like plumage or at least an immature plumage to really tackle the sparrows. If you're going to, the other element of the simplified approach is, I really recommend going back to some of the early editions of the Peterson Guide. And I really recommend this 1947 edition, which was in print for almost 40 years. It's the last version of the Peterson Guide, which really has the pure Peterson system in it. And it's not perfect by any means, but if you're really having trouble getting a handle on a group like shorebirds or ducks or you know, in any birds that confuse you, Peterson really does break them down and give you a handle on what the key differences are. Again, you don't want to use your only field guide. It's old. Some of the names are really different, but it just gives you an overview of the kind of things to look for in groups that are giving you trouble. The final thing I wanted, the key to how do you avoid getting distracted by all the rarities. And one of the ways you can really do that is to use phone apps. And I've already talked about Sibley. Sibley is my favorite current field guide. And they publish a beautiful phone app that has literally everything that's in the book. You really don't need to buy the book if you buy the app. But the problem with the book is it covers all of North America. And if you're sort of a beginner or you're working with a group you're unsure of, what you'd really like, you know, is a bird guide to the birds of Westchester County that had just the birds in your local area, not all these distracting things. But the great thing about apps is you can do that with these apps, okay? They have settings that not many people take advantage of. But this is the Sibley app, and I've set it for Delaware. I've set it to show me only common and uncommon birds, so to exclude the real rarities, and only show me birds that occur in October. And so with these settings, instead of 54 or whatever species are in the big Sibley, you only get 14 species. And all of those are pretty likely birds that you probably saw one of them. And it's a lot less intimidating to work through that small number of birds. So and most of the phone apps have settings like this. Sibley Tide gets this directly from eBird, so it's really, really helpful to do that. All right, so let's look at the common sparrows. There are two of them that I consider easy that I'm really not going to talk about. The dark-eyed junco is a passerellid, but I think it's a pretty easy bird to identify. And all the towhees are giant sparrows. They're giant passerellids. And again, our eastern towhee is pretty distinctive and pretty easy to identify. So let's focus on the other 14 or 16 species that give people trouble. As I said, the first thing I'm going to do is break these down into groups for you. And the three main groups are the streaked all over sparrows. And if you're not very familiar with sparrows, you're probably saying to yourself, well, aren't they all streaked all over? And you'll be surprised to learn that no, they're not. There's only a handful that actually are streaked all over. We have the two zebra crowned sparrows that have black and white stripes on their heads. And then we have the rusty capped sparrows that have a rusty cap. And these really are the three groups that you're going to encounter most of the time in your general birding. There is, however, a fourth group, which I've called the mouse-like sparrows. These are very habitat specific, and I will briefly discuss one of these. But again, you're not terribly likely to encounter these when you're just out generally birding. So let's start with the streaked all over sparrows. There are 5 of them. All of them have streaked breasts. That's really the critical key that they share. This again is the very common song sparrow, Savannah sparrow, fox sparrow, Lincoln sparrow, and Vesper sparrow. So what I'm going to do is go through these one by one and sort of show you the key characters that allow you to identify these. And you might say, well, this is a common bird, I know how to identify it. But again, you want to be sure that you're not overlooking one of these other ones. And you also want to give yourself a real opportunity to learn the jizz of some of these common birds, because song sparrows, you can go through a whole field of song sparrows and be flushing them, and you just don't waste time looking at them until you see something sort of different. So the first one we're going to streak all over sparrows, I have the group up here, is the song sparrow. And I've stolen something from a really great book by Pete Dunn called A Field Guide Companion. And it's the one book about jizz that I do recommend, and it is in the handouts that I give out if you want to see what it actually is. Because he only spends about 2/3 of a page on each bird, so it's actually enough to assimilate. But one of the great things he does in that book is he gives all the birds nicknames to kind of capture their jizz. And one of my favorites is he calls the blue-gray gnatcatcher the twig fairy. And I just think that that's perfect. So I'm not as creative as Pete Dunn is, but I've come up with my own nicknames that are more focused on the field marks. And so the song sparrow has the lovely name of the mutton chop sparrow. And you're probably thinking, well, why did I name this sparrow after a piece of meat? Well, I'm not talking about that kind of mutton chop. I'm talking about this kind of mutton chop, this style of men's facial hair that was popular in the 18th century and again in the 1960s when I grew up. But it's these big, massive, dark sideburns. And that's what you see in a song sparrow. That's the best mark for a song sparrow. A lot of books emphasize the dark spot on the breast. As you can see, they can hide that if they fluff the feathers in a certain way. But these big dark malar stripes here, they're very flared at the bottom, and they're always darker than the rest of the plumage, and they really stand out. And that's a unique characteristic of song sparrow. The other thing among the striped sparrows, song sparrow has the brownest and the blurriest breast streaks. And I sort of talk about song sparrows looking like they were painted with a paintbrush. That everything is kind of blurry, and the way you might think of with a watercolor. And we'll see that that's going to contrast a lot with some of the other sparrows. Like, for example, the Savannah sparrow, which is probably the second most common member of this group, which has a completely different jizz than the song sparrow. And the Savannah sparrow I've nicknamed the spiky-tailed sparrow. The song sparrow is this loose, sort of floppy, it pumps its tail, it's always kind of going in every direction. The Savannah sparrow is very tightly put together. It's a very tight bird. It doesn't flop around a lot, and it has this short, spiky tail. The best field mark for Savannah sparrow is this yellow eyebrow. This is a bird I photographed in May, so that eyebrow is very bright on this individual. Some of them don't have that at all, so that's not always your best mark. A mark that's probably better is the fact that they have a whitish breast with very fine, sharp, dark streaking on it. And so again, very different from the streaking on a song sparrow breast. And finally, as their name mentions, they have this short, stiff, spiky tail that they keep in the same position all the time and don't flop around with it the way a song sparrow does. So that's Savannah sparrow. The next one is fox sparrow. Definitely one of my favorite sparrows, a lot of people's favorite sparrows. And I've come up with a very clever nickname for fox sparrow, and that is fox sparrow. I think this bird has one of the most perfect names of any bird. It really, particularly if you think of a gray fox, this really has the colors of a fox. It is gray and rufous with some white on the breast. It really does not have any brown or tan on it anywhere. And that's a really distinctive thing about fox sparrows. So usually the color by itself is enough to help you tell that you've got a fox sparrow. They're very large compared to something like a song sparrow. But if you're a little uncertain, if you think maybe it's a bright song sparrow, a couple other key features are this big bicolored bill, dark on top, yellow below. And something that isn't often mentioned is these arrowhead shaped breast spots. So when you can't see the color of the bill or the bird's looking right at you, look at these spots. And with the spots with these little points on them like that are very unique to fox sparrow. Finally, we come to Lincoln sparrow. This is a pretty uncommon to rare bird in our area. It's one a lot of birders are looking for, particularly in fall migration. The last 2 weeks of September, first week of October, these guys will come through. And I've nicknamed them the pen-streaked sparrow because they're really, again, it's something once you've seen enough of them, they look like they were drawn with a very fine pen and ink set. They're very crisp, very finely drawn, very different from the painted song sparrow. And again, usually instantly recognizable just by that characteristic alone. But if you're looking for field marks, the upper breast here with these fine black dark streaks, and in about 90% of them, they have this buffy breast band across the front of the breast. And again, sometimes they have a white breast without this, but again, they're very finely streaked. And another really good field mark when they don't have that breast band is they have these buffy malar stripes that contrast with the gray face. Whereas in something like a song sparrow, these malar stripes will be the same color as the face. So that will help you pick out Lincoln sparrows in the fall. And again, compared to song sparrows, they're a more compact, sort of tighter bird, maybe not quite as tight as a Savannah sparrow, but they're pretty tightly put together. The last bird is a Vesper sparrow. I'm not sure what its distribution is like in southeastern Pennsylvania, but here in Delaware, this is a pretty uncommon bird. There are a couple known breeding locations in southern Delaware, and a handful are seen in migration every year. So another fairly sought after species. The field mark that's always emphasized with Vesper sparrow is the white outer tail feathers. But if you've never seen a Vesper sparrow, you're thinking, oh, it's going to be like a junco. And it's not. Juncos have 2.5 white feathers on each side of the tail. The Vesper sparrow has a half a white feather. So if it's flying away from you, you can pick up the white outer tail feathers, but they're nothing like you would see on a junco. And the real thing to go for with these is the eye ring. This is the eye ring sparrow. They have this nice white eye ring. They also have a distinctive facial pattern. So they have the white eye ring. They also have this distinctive facial pattern where the frame around the auriculars is not complete, and they have these 2 spots. And I've read in several books, they call this a long spur-like face pattern, which I think is pretty useless description because they're assuming you can identify long spurs and you're very familiar with them, but you don't know what a Vesper sparrow looks like. So what they're referring to is sort of this broken auricular frame here that results in these 2 spots on the face. Okay, and that's it. Those are the sparrows that have streaked breasts that you're likely to encounter in this general area. So let's look at the zebra-crowned sparrows. These are the ones that have the big black and white head stripes, and you'd probably think, well, they're pretty easy to identify. And to some extent they are, but of course we're talking about the white-throated and the white-crowned sparrow. And white-throated sparrows can often look like this. In fact, if you're looking at them now, they're all molted into breeding plumage. They actually occur in 2 morphs. This is the white striped morph, and this was shot in late April. And they've got these beautiful, head pattern. It's this black and white stripes, the yellow, bright yellow lores, and this beautifully demarcated white throat. And when they look like this, they're pretty easy to identify. But I've nicknamed them the dirty sparrow because they don't always look like this. And in fact, in the middle of the winter, most of them don't look like this. Most of them look uh, like the bird I'm about to show you. And I just put this up here to say this is one of the confusion species. This is one of the species that's going to throw you for a loop. And it's going to throw you for a loop when they look like this. This is an immature in the winter. They're kind of dirty and messy looking. They have streaked, sort of dirty looking breasts. And you're just like, what the heck is that? And the best thing you've got going for you on white-throated sparrow, though, is it still has this head pattern. It's muted. It's not the beautiful black and white head pattern of that white striped breeding male, but it's got the bold head stripes. It got the yellow lores are there, and it has, in particular, this demarcated white throat. And so you need, and they're usually in flocks, and usually there's some prettier looking ones in there. So don't let this throw you. But when you see a bird that you don't recognize that's confusing you, ask yourself, why isn't that an immature white-throated sparrow? And if you can eliminate that, well, then you got to move on to something else. But oftentimes the answer will be yes. Now, the other reason I named this the dirty sparrow is to contrast it with the white-crowned sparrow. This is an adult white-crowned sparrow, which I've nicknamed the immaculate sparrow. These guys really are immaculate. They show almost no individual variability in the adult plumage, and they always, every single one of them looks like this. And there's just no messy, streaky stuff on them ever at all. They just have this immaculate gray breast that goes from chin to tail. And they have this pinkish or orangish bill. The white throat has a gray bill. And so again, these adults should, if you've been seeing a lot of dirty, messy, white-throated sparrows, when one of these guys pops up, you will usually recognize it immediately. But of course, they have another plumage, which I've already shown you earlier in the talk, the immature white-throated white-crowned sparrow. But if you don't know what an immature white-crowned sparrow is, you're probably not going to immediately put it in this category. You're going to put it in the next category, which is the rusty-capped sparrows. And this is the last sort of group of commonly encountered sparrows. They all have rusty caps, and they all have more or less plain breasts. And this includes the chipping sparrow, the field sparrow, and the swamp sparrow, which are three of our most common species. Also include the American tree sparrow, which we find here in winter. I've actually, in the 12 or 13 years I've lived in this area, I've sort of noticed them decreasing. And I'm a little worried about American tree sparrow. And also, we're going to put the immature white-crowned sparrow in here, because again, if you don't have any idea what it is, you're going to think it's a rusty-capped sparrow. So let's run through these guys pretty quickly. A breeding plumage chipping sparrow is pretty distinctive. Look at the black bill, the bright rusty crown, the gray breast. But I've called this the eyeliner sparrow because that's really the critical field mark at all times for chipping sparrow, is the fact that it has this black eye line and it runs all the way through the eye and connects to the bill. And this really is the only sparrow that has an eye line like this. And the reason this is important to know versus some of the other field marks is this is the second of our confusion species, and that's because they have seasonal variability. And like I say, this was a chipping sparrow photographed in May. They got the black bill, the bright rusty cap, the black eye line. They look beautiful. But in the middle of the winter, they look more like this. The bill is now pale. The head pattern is kind of hard to discern. And I'll admit, I photographed this bird in the field not knowing what it was. And I came home and looked at the photograph. And what I noticed was here's a dark eye line through the eye all the way to the bill. So this is a chipping sparrow. But again, they're going to throw you in this plumage. And so if you see a bird that you're like, I don't know what that is, think to yourself, why is this not a winter plumaged chipping sparrow? And look for this dark eye line running all the way to the bill. The field sparrow is another very common species, a widespread breeder in fields. It is very well named. And it's also great because it really shows very little variability. Some are more gray, some are more pink, buffy colored. but I call this the baby face sparrow, because the thing that hits you immediately when you look at a field sparrow is this sort of blank faced look. There are no markings around the eye. And again, almost instantaneous recognition usually just by this feature, excuse me, alone. They do have the bright pink bill, which can also be a supporting mark, but you just saw chipping sparrow with a very pale bill. So again, the fact that there's nothing really around this eye at all. They have this very blank faced look. Usually, and again, they don't vary much between immature and adult. They don't vary much. Now, juveniles, totally different story, and they don't vary much seasonally. So they're nice birds to identify. The last of these rusty cap sparrows is the immature white crowned sparrow. And really what this looks like is, I call it the rusty striped sparrow, because instead of black and white stripes, it has rusty and tan stripes up here. And it really does look like a giant field sparrow. It has the pink bill, it's got a blank face, very plain breast. But of course, if you're seeing it in the field, it literally is almost twice the size of a field sparrow. It's a much chunkier bird with sort of relatively shorter tail. But if you really need a mark that is going to tell you this is a white crown, there it is. It does have an eye line behind the eye that the blank-faced field sparrow doesn't have. But again, once you've seen a fair number of these two species, they look more alike in photographs than they do in the field. And that brings us to the swamp sparrow. Again, this is a breeding swamp sparrow. They can be very distinctive. They're very dark birds overall. And I've called them the rusty winged sparrow because the big mark here is this rusty wing panel. They have the primary coverts and the flight feathers on most of them are rusty without any other markings. There's no wing bars here. They just have this big rusty panel on the side. And oftentimes they do have this dark grayish face, which contrasts with the rusty cap and the rusty wing. And so that can make them very distinctive. But they are the last of our confusion species because in the winter, they often look more like this. And I really went on the internet and tried to find the nastiest, most confusing swamp sparrow I could find. They even are confused at times with Lincoln sparrows in this plumage. They do, I'm sorry, they do have sort of a streaky breast. The wing panel maybe is more muted. They have, these face markings. If you look closely, you can see there's some rusty feathers in this crown. But that isn't always obvious. As I pointed out here, one thing to really focus on weird swamp sparrows is this long gray bill. It is sort of a different shape than most other sparrows. It's not the shape a Lincoln sparrow would have. And again, the unmarked throat will help separate them from other things like Lincoln sparrow. But this is one that really will throw you. And again, now you've got the checklist. When you see a weird sparrow, is this an immature white throat? Is this a winter chipping sparrow, or is this a winter swamp sparrow? Those are the three that are really going to throw you. The last of the rusty cap sparrows, again, is probably the rarest, is the American tree sparrow. It's a beautiful, crisp bird. They all look exactly the same, and they're very distinctive. I call them the stick pin sparrow. This dark central breast spot is called a stick pin. In the middle of a plain gray breast, there's this big dark smudge. They also have this beautiful rusty eye line that's the same color as the cap, and they have a bicolored bill. And I have occasionally had people send me photos of swamp sparrows, again, the confusion species, saying, isn't this an American tree sparrow? Because they do have kind of a smudgy breast and a apparently bicolored bill, and but they don't have wing bars. Okay. American tree sparrows have two, one of them's hidden here, two white wing bars that are very prominent, and you will never see those on a swamp sparrow. So generally one of my favorite birds. I love the calls that they make, and they're just always these sort of crisp, nicely plumaged birds. So the last group to consider here, and I'm just going to touch on one of these, and mention the rest, is the mouse-like sparrows. They are very habitat specific, and I mean very. They are only found in very specific habitats, and that's a big clue to identifying them. And one of those habitats is grassy fields, and there's where you find the grasshopper sparrow, and you don't find them anywhere else. And so you really almost have to go looking for grasshopper sparrow on purpose in its specific sort of short grass habitats. The other three mouse-like sparrows in this area are confined to salt marshes or some freshwater marshes. Seaside sparrow only ever found in salt marshes. The salt marsh sparrow usually restricted to salt marshes. The Nelson sparrow is usually found in salt marshes, but it's occasionally found inland as well. There are inland freshwater breeding populations of it, so you might find it in central Pennsylvania, for example. But these are specific enough to their habitats, and it's that I'm not going to talk about them. I will briefly just take a look at the grasshopper sparrow, though. This is a grasshopper sparrow, and I've nicknamed them the buff-breasted sparrow. They do remind you in some ways of a buff-breasted sandpiper. They have this plain buffy breast, buffy face, a big bill, flat head. And again, if you're in a grassy area that has grass, probably no more than knee high, and you flush a bird that looks like this, that's got to be what it is. So the buffy, they're found in these open grassy fields, the plain buffy breast and the yellow and sometimes even orange lores. The only other species usually found with grasshoppers is savanna. And of course, it has those dark breast streaks. So it's usually, if you can get a look at these guys, they are mouse-like in that they don't like to flush, they rather run, they don't show off very well. So the challenge is getting a good look. But when you do, I think you can identify them fairly quickly. So that's sort of the tour of the common species. And just to sort of recap here, I hope you see how I've broken them into these groups. And really the three, the streaked sparrows, the zebra striped, and the rusty capped is the way to go. If you really don't know where to get started with sparrows, start there, put them in those groups, and then start working through the different members of the groups. And again, we've broken it down, I hope, into groups that are not too intimidating. Again, don't consider Bachman sparrow or Casson sparrow or crazy stuff like that. Keep the three confusion birds. Every time you see a bird you can't identify, why isn't this an immature white throat? Why isn't this an immature chipping? Why isn't this an immature swamp? Increase your skills by lingering over identified birds, and again, avoid July and August. So in conclusion, I hope at the beginning of this talk, maybe this is what you thought most sparrows looked like. And I hope that I have taken you at least part way to realizing that they are fairly distinctive and there are easy ways to tell them apart. But the most important thing I want to emphasize is a lot of times people don't do sparrows because they get frustrated. And I do want to come back and emphasize, have fun with these. You don't have to identify every bird you see to species, but try to learn something from every bird that you do see. And I guess, as mentioned in my introduction, I really enjoy these identification challenges. I really enjoy telling Nelson sparrow from salt marsh sparrow and things like that. But if you're still at the level where you're trying to tell a savanna sparrow from a white throat, have fun with that too, and do enjoy the diversity of sparrows that we have here. So if you want a PDF copy of this, that's my email address, mcmoore32@gmail.com. Just shoot me an email and say I saw your talk and I'd like a copy of it, and I can send that stuff right out to you. So let me see if I can stop sharing my screen, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions.